The rain came down hard on Waco that Thursday night. Not the gentle kind of Texas rain that cools the air and smells like dust turning soft. This was the other kind. The kind that hammers the pavement and fills the gutters and makes the neon signs bleed their colors across standing water in parking lots. The Iron Horse Tavern sat on the edge of Route 77, about 6 miles outside the city proper. It was the kind of place that didn't advertise, didn't need to. The people who knew about it had always known about it, and the people who didn't were probably better off. At 11:47 on a Thursday night, the parking lot behind the Iron Horse was empty except for 3 trucks, a row of motorcycles lined up along the fence like soldiers, and the rain. Then the shots came. 3 of them, fast, clean. The sound cracked through the wet air and scattered the silence like breaking glass. A woman in blue scrubs was walking across that parking lot when she heard them. Her name was Loretta Calloway, though most people who knew her just called her Rhett. She had just come off a 12-hour shift at Providence Medical Center. She still had a smear of dried blood on her left forearm that she hadn't noticed yet. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her shoes were the kind nurses wear, thick-soled, quiet, built for long hours on hard floors. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be afraid. She wasn't. She turned toward the sound without thinking about it, the way a person does when their instincts have been trained by years of emergency rooms, by years of running toward the thing that everyone else runs away from. And she saw him. A large man, heavy through the shoulders, a black leather vest over a dark jacket, patches on the back she couldn't read in the rain and the dark. He was on his knees in a puddle of water that was already turning the color of rust. One hand pressed to his left side, the other hand flat on the wet asphalt, holding himself up. 3 men were moving away into the darkness at the far edge of the parking lot, running. They didn't look back. Red had crossed that distance before she made the decision to cross it. That was the thing about 24 years in an emergency room. Your body learned to move before your mind caught up with the reasons. She was already on her knees beside him, already pressing, already counting, before the last echo of the 3rd shot had finished moving through the wet air. He was heavy through the shoulders, and his breathing was shallow but present, and she had worked with worse. Much worse. He turned his head and looked at her with eyes that had been through considerable things and did not ask for help easily. "Why?" he said. The word came out rough, wet. "Why are you doing this?" Rhett didn't look up from what her hands were doing. "Because it's what I do," she said. "Stay still." She pressed harder. She became aware of her own shoulder first, then her left side. She glanced down, registered the blood spreading through her jacket, and filed it away under later. Right now, there was this man and his wound, and the 911 call she was already making with her free hand. He looked up at her. The rain was coming down on both of them, and the overhead light caught the water on his face and in the gray of his beard. And he was watching her with an expression she would think about later. Not gratitude exactly, but the look of a man confronting something he hadn't expected to find in the world. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rhett," she said. "Don't talk, just breathe." In the distance, the first siren was beginning. The rain kept falling on the Iron Horse parking lot, on the row of motorcycles along the fence, on the blood spreading through the standing water on the dark asphalt, on 2 strangers who had arrived at the same place by completely different roads, and were now bound together by something that had no name yet, but would have one soon enough. She had not hesitated, not for a single second. And that, not the bullets, not the rain, not the man bleeding in front of her, was the thing Rhett Calloway would think about later when she finally let herself think about any of it. Everything else was still coming, like the storm moving in from the west. 36 hours earlier. The morning started the way most of Rhett Calloway's mornings started, with someone else's crisis. 6 o'clock, the overnight shift winding down, Providence Medical Center humming with the particular exhausted energy of a hospital at the end of a long night. Rhett was in Bay 4, suturing a gash on the forearm of a man named Gerald who had explained, with impressive dignity for someone bleeding on a hospital gurney at dawn, that the wound had been caused by a disagreement with a fence post. She didn't ask follow-up questions. In 24 years of emergency nursing, she had learned that the real story behind a wound was usually either much sadder or much stranger than whatever version the patient offered first, and that pressing for it rarely helped anyone. What helped was the work. Clean the wound, assess the depth, close it properly, make sure the person in front of you leaves in better condition than they arrived. That was the job. That had always been the job. Her hands moved with a precision that only comes from repetition, so complete it stops being conscious. The needle moved. The thread pulled. Gerald hissed and looked away. "You've done this before," he said. "Once or twice," Rhett said. A young nurse named Bethany, 26 years old, 3 months on the floor, still in the phase where the job felt like a calling rather than a wait, appeared at the edge of the bay and watched for a moment. "How do you do that?" Bethany asked. "Do what?" "Stay calm. He came in with a 6-inch gash and you're just sewing." Rhett tied off the last suture before she answered. "I'm scared," she said. "I'm just scared after." Bethany thought about that. Rhett pulled off her gloves and moved on. The locker room at the end of a night shift had a particular kind of quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly. Someone had left a half-eaten granola bar on the bench. Rhett sat down in front of her locker and took a breath that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. 12 hours, 2 cardiac events, 1 overdose, a 19-year-old boy, and she had stood over him for 38 minutes before his heart remembered what it was supposed to do. 1 broken pelvis from a fall, Gerald and his fence post. And in the margins of all of it, the constant low-grade management of a department that never had quite enough of anything. Nurses, beds, patients, time. She opened her locker. On the inside of the door, she had taped a photograph a long time ago. She didn't remember exactly when. It felt like it had always been there. Boyd Calloway looked back at her from that photograph the way he always had, like he was about to say something that would make her laugh, even though she didn't want to. He was leaning against the truck he'd driven for 14 years, squinting into late afternoon sun, his hair doing what it always did, which was exactly what it wanted. He had been 44 in that photograph. He had died at 46. Rhett looked at him for a moment, just a moment, the way she always did, quickly, before the moment could grow into something she didn't have the energy to carry through the rest of her day. She closed the locker. She picked up her bag. She walked out. The drive home took her down Hewitt Drive, past the strip malls and the fast food signs, past the church where she used to take Austin when he was small, past the garage where Boyd used to take the truck every spring for a full check before driving season. The garage had a different name on the sign now. Different owner, different everything. She didn't slow down. What she did slow down for, without quite deciding to, was the intersection at Maple and 5th, where 3 of the 9 Voss Family Pharmacy locations she knew of in McLennan County were visible within a 2-block radius. 1 on the corner, 1 across the street, 1 half a block down, newer than the others, with a bright sign and a drive-through window that had been open since 6 in the morning. Sterling Voss had built that chain over 15 years, 20 locations across 3 counties now. He was photographed at ribbon cuttings. He gave to churches. He had been district attorney for 11 years across 3 terms, and when people in Waco talked about him, they usually used words like steady and tough and one of us. Rhett sat at the red light and looked at the pharmacy on the corner. The light changed. She drove. At home, she made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and listened to the radio the way Boyd used to. Not really listening, just letting the sound fill the house so it didn't feel so large. A news segment came on. She recognized the voice before she heard the name. And today, District Attorney Sterling Voss broke ground on the county's newest addiction recovery center, calling it a cornerstone of his ongoing commitment to fighting the opioid crisis that has devastated families across Central Texas. Rhett reached over and turned the radio off. Not with anger, just with the quiet, practiced motion of someone who has turned that particular thing off many times before. She stood in the silence for a moment. Then she opened the kitchen drawer, the third one down, the deep one, and she looked at what was in it. A cell phone. Old model. The screen dark, the battery long dead. Boyd's phone. She had never turned it back on after he died. Had never been able to bring herself to charge it. She had kept it in that drawer for 6 years the way you keep certain things. Not because you use them, not because you've forgiven the fact of their existence, but because getting rid of them feels like agreeing to something you're not ready to agree to. She looked at it for a moment, closed the drawer. In the back of that same drawer, behind Boyd's phone, her hand had passed over the grip of the .38 revolver she kept there for 3 years. She noted it the way you note a thing that is present and accounted for and does not yet need to be acted on. Went to bed. Across town, in a garage that smelled like oil and metal and coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate since early morning, a different kind of morning was underway. The chapter's garage sat off Industrial Boulevard, behind a chain-link fence with a gate that was always locked from the outside and always open from the inside to the right people. There were 9 bikes in the garage that morning, and the sound of at least 3 conversations happening at once, and a radio playing something from the mid-70s that nobody had bothered to change. Hawkins Bridle, Hawk to everyone in that room and most people outside it, was working on a 1965 Harley-Davidson Panhead that had been in various states of restoration for the better part of 3 years. This was not a sign of failure. This was a sign of a man who understood that some things deserve to be done slowly, and that the work itself has a value separate from the completion of it. He was 67 years old. He had a face that had earned every line on it. His hands were large and calloused, and they moved over the engine with the deliberate confidence he brought to everything. Not the confidence of someone who had never failed, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from having failed and gotten back up enough times that getting back up has become automatic. He had served with the Marines during Desert Storm in 1991. He had been 23 years old when he shipped out to Kuwait. He didn't talk about that much, and the men in this garage had long ago stopped asking. What they knew was this: when Hawk gave you his word, it held. When he told you something was right, it was right. When he said you didn't have to worry, you didn't have to worry. And when he said things were serious, you paid attention. The chapter had rules, not the kind written down anywhere, the kind that lived in the way men treated each other, in the decisions made without discussion, because everyone already knew what the right answer was. No drugs moved through their territory. No civilians got pulled into chapter business. No man got left behind in a bad situation if there was any possible way to get him out. These weren't ideals. They were the actual operating principles of the group, enforced not by fear, but by the collective agreement of men who had decided, at some point, that they wanted to be the kind of people who stood for something. Decker came in from the side door at 8:15 in the morning. He was 38, which made him young by the standards of this room. He had a face that had never quite decided whether to be handsome or intimidating, and had settled on a kind of permanent alertness instead. 9 years with the chapter. Hawk trusted him the way he trusted very few people, not because Decker was perfect, but because Decker was honest about the ways in which he wasn't. He came in quietly. He set a small, black USB drive on the workbench next to Hawk's tools. Hawk didn't stop working, but his attention shifted in the way attention shifts when someone walks into a room carrying something heavier than what they're holding. "Where?" Hawk said. "Donnie Marsh," Decker said. "Found him this morning." "He's gone, Hawk. They did it clean." Hawk set down the wrench. He picked up the USB drive and turned it over in his fingers. This was on him? Inside the lining of his jacket. Whoever searched him missed it. "Did you open it?" "I tried. Most of it's locked. But there's one file that's just text. Wasn't encrypted." He handed Hawk a folded piece of paper. Hawk unfolded it and read what Decker had printed out. 7 words. That was all. Voss, Providence Medical. Shipment 17, Friday night. Hawk read it twice. He folded the paper back along its crease and held it for a moment without speaking. Friday night. Tonight was Thursday. He looked up at the clock on the garage wall. 8:22 in the morning. 36 hours. Does anyone else know about this? He asked. Just me, Decker said. Hawk pocketed the USB drive and the folded paper. He picked up the wrench again and looked at the engine in front of him. The careful, patient work of it, the years it represented, and he stayed with the weight of what he just read for a long moment before he spoke again. Tonight, he said quietly, I go alone. Decker started to say something. Alone, Hawk said again, not harshly, just with the finality of a decision already made by a man who had made enough decisions to know what they felt like when they were finished. Decker nodded. He understood what the word meant when Hawk used it. He didn't like it, but he understood it. The chapter rules said no man gets left behind. They said nothing about a man choosing to walk in front. The day passed the way days do when something is coming that you can feel but can't name. Rhett slept until early afternoon, later than she meant to and earlier than she needed to. She made a second pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and looked at things she had looked at many times before. Articles, public records, old news segments. She never found anything she could use. She always found enough to make her unable to stop. The numbers that bothered her most were the ones at Providence Medical Center. She had worked in that pharmacy supply chain long enough to know what normal looked like, and she had been watching the numbers drift away from normal for 2 years. No matter how she arranged them, they didn't add up to anything innocent. Opioid intake up 280% over 18 months. Signed off every single time by Dr. Warren Pruitt, who had joined the hospital's medical staff 14 months ago, 2 months after Sterling Voss's most recent re-election, with a letter of recommendation signed by Voss himself. She had looked at these numbers until she could see them with her eyes closed. She had checked them against patient census data, against regional prescription trends, against every legitimate explanation she could construct. None of the legitimate explanations held. 2 years of this, and she had never been able to find the next piece. The thing that would take what she knew from a pattern of numbers to something she could put in front of someone and say, here, this is what it means. This is what it proves. She closed the laptop. She made dinner. She called Austin. He answered on the 3rd ring, relaxed and easy, the way he always sounded when things were genuinely fine, finishing a paper, eating a real meal, a friend's birthday on Saturday. Could he borrow $20? She said yes. They talked for 12 minutes. She told him she loved him, and he said it back the way young adults say it, quickly, warmly, already moving on to the next thing, and she smiled after she hung up because that combination, the quickness and the warmth together, meant she had done something right somewhere along the way. It was 8:45 in the evening. 40 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She picked it up. The screen showed a photograph. Austin, standing outside what looked like a parking garage, a hand on his shoulder belonging to someone cut out of the frame. His expression was neutral, the way a person looks when they don't know they're being photographed. He was wearing the gray jacket she'd given him for his birthday. Below the photograph, a message. Come alone. Iron Horse Tavern, Route 77, parking lot behind the building, 11 p.m. Tell no one or this gets worse. Rhett read it once. She set the phone face down on the table. She sat completely still, not frozen, not panicking, but doing the things she had learned to do when everything was going wrong at once, and there was no time and someone's life was in her hands. She let her mind work through what she knew, what she didn't, and what needed to happen in what order. Then she stood up. She walked to the kitchen and opened the 3rd drawer, the deep one. She looked at Boyd's old phone for 1 second. Then she reached past it. Her hand closed around the grip of the .38 revolver. She checked the cylinder. 5 rounds. She closed it. She put the gun in the pocket of her jacket. She checked the time. 40 minutes. She put on her jacket. She picked up her keys. At the door, she stopped. She turned back and looked at the kitchen, the coffee maker, the table, the drawer she'd left slightly open. The photograph of Boyd on the small shelf by the window, his face in the late afternoon light of a day that was now 6 years gone. He had told her something once, early in their marriage, when she was still learning what it meant to be the kind of person who ran toward problems instead of away from them. Courage isn't the absence of fear, he had said. It's the decision that something matters more. She looked at his photograph for 3 seconds. Then she went out into the rain. The drive to Iron Horse Tavern took 22 minutes. She parked on the street, not in the lot, and walked the last block with her hand in her jacket pocket and her eyes moving across everything in front of her. The parking lot behind the building was lit by 2 overhead lights doing their best against the rain. 3 trucks along one edge. A row of motorcycles along the fence. Wet asphalt. Standing water. No one visible. She was halfway across when she heard voices from the far side. Low, fast, the sound of men conducting business they didn't want witnessed. She turned her head and through the rain she saw them. 3 men, and on the ground between them and the fence, kneeling, a large man in a black leather vest. She pulled the .38 from her pocket. The shots came before she could use it. 3 of them. The large man went down. The 3 men turned and ran into the dark. Rhett was already moving. She holstered the gun and dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands found the wound, left side below the ribs, losing blood at a pace that required immediate and sustained pressure. She applied it with both hands and leaned in and began to count his breaths. The pain in her shoulder arrived first, then her left side. She looked down and understood. 2 rounds at some point in those few seconds had found her. She registered this the way she registered all incoming information under pressure. Noted, filed, not acted on until the immediate priority was stable. The immediate priority was the man in front of her. She called 911. She gave the location. She described his injuries first, then hers. She stayed on the call. He turned his head and looked at her with those dark eyes. A face that had been through things. A face that didn't ask for help easily. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. And the rain came down on both of them. And the overhead light caught the water moving through the gray of his beard. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "You don't know me." "I don't need to," Rhett said. "Breathe, slow and even." He breathed. He was the kind of tough that doesn't announce itself, the kind that lives quietly inside a person and holds them together when everything else is falling apart. She had treated that kind of tough before. She knew how to work with it. In the distance, the first siren was winding up. The rain kept falling on the Iron Horse parking lot, on the motorcycles lined up along the fence like sentinels, on the 2 strangers kneeling together in the standing water, and the dark, bound now by something neither of them had chosen, and neither of them would be able to walk back from. 36 hours earlier, Rhett Calloway had opened a kitchen drawer and looked at her dead husband's phone and closed it again without charging it. Now she had 2 bullets in her body and both hands on a stranger's wound. And the thing she was certain of, the only thing in that rain-soaked moment, was that she had not hesitated. Not once. She had seen what needed doing, and she had done it, the way she had always done it, the way Boyd had always said she would. Everything else, the why, the who, the long, dark thread connecting this parking lot to a dead husband and 6 years of unanswered questions, and a name she had been trying to forget. All of that was still ahead, still coming, like the storm still moving in from the west. The hospital room was quiet in the way that hospital rooms are never truly quiet. Machines tracking, somewhere down the hall a cart rolling, a door closing, the building breathing around its own machinery. Rhett lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and waited for the painkillers to make up their mind about whether they were going to work. The surgeon had told her she was lucky. She had heard that word applied to herself enough times in the past 24 hours that it had started to lose its meaning. 2 bullets. The one in the shoulder had missed the joint. The one along her ribs had missed everything critical. Lucky. She lay in the bed and thought about the word and decided it was the kind of thing people said when they meant something slightly different but didn't have the language for it. Through the window of her room she could see, across the hallway and through a second window, the room where they had put the man she had knelt beside in the parking lot. She couldn't see him from this angle. She could see the light in the room was on. She could see a figure, large, seated, occasionally visible when someone opened the inner door. She knew his name now. The paramedics had used it. The nurses had used it. Hawkins Bridle. She hadn't connected it to anything yet. The name sat in her mind the way new information does when you're running on no sleep and 2 bullet wounds. Present, noted, not yet filed. At 7:45 in the morning, the door to her room opened and a man walked in who was not a doctor. He was in his early 40s, dark jacket over a button-down, a face that had the particular arrangement of a man who asked questions for a living, not aggressive, but always slightly ahead of you, watching the space between what you said and what you meant. He introduced himself as Deputy Colt Burgess, McLennan County Sheriff's Department. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat in it with the practiced ease of someone who had sat in a lot of hospital chairs, asking a lot of questions of a lot of people who would have preferred he didn't. He took out a notepad. He asked her what she was doing in the parking lot of the Iron Horse Tavern at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. Rhett told him about the text message, about the photograph of Austin, about the number she didn't recognize. Burgess wrote things down. He didn't look up while he wrote. She told him Austin was a student at UT Austin. She told him she hadn't called the police because the message said not to, and she had believed, in the moment, that she didn't have time. Burgess looked up. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "your son has been at his dormitory all evening. We confirmed it at 2:15 this morning. He's fine. He doesn't know any of this happened." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "The photograph," she said, "could have been taken any time. Could have been taken from his social media. The number the text came from is a burner, already dead." He paused. "Somebody wanted you in that parking lot last night, and whoever it was went to some trouble to make sure you came alone and didn't call for help first." He let that sit there. "Why you?" he asked. "I don't know," Rhett said. It wasn't entirely true. It wasn't entirely a lie. There were things forming in the back of her mind that were not yet thoughts, more like pressures, like the feeling before a headache. She held them there, in the back, and kept her face still. Burgess looked at her for a moment, in the way people look at you when they're deciding whether to believe you. Then he asked about the man she had tried to help, whether she knew him, whether she had seen him before, whether she had any reason to be acquainted with members of the chapter he was affiliated with. She said no to all of it. He closed his notepad. He stood. He told her someone would follow up, and he said it with the flat professionalism of someone who might mean it or might not, and she couldn't tell which. At the door he stopped. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you work here, at Providence Medical." 24 years, she said. He nodded once. Like that confirmed something he'd been working out in his head on the way over. Like it was the answer to a question he hadn't asked out loud. He left. Rhett lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the pressure in the back of her mind begin to organize itself into something that resembled a thought. Providence Medical, the text, the parking lot, a man named Hawkins Bridle who had been shot by people who didn't look like amateurs, and the name of her hospital sitting somewhere in all of it, like a pin in a map. She didn't know yet how they connected, but she had learned in 24 years of emergency nursing that when things stopped feeling like coincidence, they usually weren't. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. Across the hall, in the room with the light on, Hawk Bridle was also not sleeping. He was sitting upright against the headboard with his arms folded, which the nurse had told him 3 times was not good for his shoulder, and he had thanked her each time and gone back to sitting the same way. The wound was through the muscle of his left shoulder, painful, significant, but not the kind of thing that was going to slow him down more than a few days. He had been shot before. Not recently, but before. He understood the architecture of the pain and knew how to work around it. Decker had appeared at 6 in the morning, before visiting hours, in the way that Decker appeared at places when Hawk needed him to. Quietly, without announcing himself, through whichever door was least observed. He had stood by the window and given Hawk the information he'd gathered through the night, speaking low and steady, and Hawk had listened with his eyes open and his face showing nothing. After Decker left, Hawk stayed with what he'd been told. The woman who had shielded him with her own body, Loretta Calloway, went by Rhett, ER nurse at Providence Medical for 24 years, widowed 6 years ago, 1 son in college, had not been there by accident. Someone had manufactured a reason to get her to that parking lot. And the reason she specifically had been chosen, as best as Decker could piece together in a few hours of careful inquiry, appeared to be the place where she worked. Providence Medical Center, the same name on the USB drive. Hawk thought about that for a long time. He thought about a woman in blue scrubs kneeling in a rain-soaked parking lot with 2 bullets in her, and both hands still pressing hard on someone else's wound. He thought about the expression on her face, not heroic, not performing anything, just focused, just working. The face of someone who had decided, without drama, what the situation required. He said to the empty room, quietly, "Find out everything about her." Then, after a pause, "and make sure nothing else happens to her." On Friday afternoon, Rhett left the hospital. The surgeon had wanted her to stay another night. She had declined with the particular combination of politeness and finality that nurses deploy when they want to be difficult without appearing difficult. She was signed out by 2 in the afternoon, prescriptions in hand, left arm in a sling she intended to remove as soon as she got to the car. She drove home. She showered. She changed into clothes that didn't hurt to put on. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She pulled up the Providence Medical internal supply records she had access to from her employee portal. The same records she had been studying intermittently for 2 years, watching the numbers drift further and further from any pattern that made clinical sense. 280% increase in controlled substance intake over 18 months. Every shipment signed off by Dr. Warren Pruitt. Dr. Warren Pruitt, who had arrived at Providence Medical 14 months ago with a letter from Sterling Voss, and who had, in those 14 months, signed off on more controlled substance procurement orders than the previous department head had signed in 4 years. She had looked at these numbers so many times she could see them when she closed her eyes. She had turned them over from every angle she knew. She had checked them against patient census data, against regional prescription trends, against every legitimate explanation she could construct. None of the legitimate explanations held. She had been doing this for 2 years, and she had never been able to find the next piece. The thing that would take what she knew from a pattern of numbers to something she could put in front of someone and say, "Here, this is what it means." She was still staring at the screen when someone knocked on the front door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She went to the door with her right hand near her jacket pocket. Old habit, new habit, hard to tell anymore which was which. She looked through the peephole. The man standing on her porch was large, gray-bearded. He had his left arm in a sling that matched hers, and he was wearing a black leather vest over a dark jacket. And he was standing with the patient stillness of a man who would wait as long as it took. Hawk Bridle. She opened the door. They looked at each other for a moment. "I didn't give you my address," she said. "No," he said, "you didn't." She considered that for a second. Then she stepped back from the door. He came inside. He looked at the house the way people look at a place when they're reading it. Not inspecting, just registering. The coffee maker, the laptop open on the table, the photograph on the small shelf by the window, the man in it leaning against a truck and squinting into the sun. He stopped at that photograph for just a moment. "Your husband?" he asked. "Boyd," she said. "He died 6 years ago." Hawk looked at the photograph. His face moved in a way she couldn't quite read. "He's wearing a Lone Star MC patch on that jacket," Hawk said. "He wasn't a member of anything," Rhett said. "He just liked the jacket. He bought it at a swap meet in Hillsboro." Hawk nodded slowly. "He looks like a man who kept his word." It was such a specific thing to say. Not, "He looks like a good man," or "I'm sorry for your loss," but that Rhett found herself without a response for a moment. "He did," she said finally. Hawk reached into the inside pocket of his vest and put a black USB drive on the kitchen table. "I need you to tell me what Providence Medical is," he said. "What it means in whatever this is." Rhett looked at the drive. Then she looked at him. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make more coffee." They sat across the table from each other, and she told him what she knew. The numbers, the procurement orders, Pruitt's arrival and its timing, the patterns she had been watching for 2 years without being able to name. She spoke plainly and without drama, the way she spoke about everything, and she watched him listen with the absolute stillness of a man who was putting things in order as he heard them. When she finished, he told her about the USB drive, about the single, unencrypted line of text, about Donnie Marsh, the chapter member who had died carrying it. The name Sterling Voss sat between them on the table like something heavy. "He signed Pruitt's letter," Rhett said. "His name is on the drive," Hawk said. She stood and refilled both coffees. When she sat back down, she said, "There's something else." She told him about Boyd. Not the version she told most people. The clean, survivable version where it was a tragic accident on a dark highway, and the driver of the truck had been charged, and ultimately the case had gone nowhere for the usual reasons that cases go nowhere. She told him the rest of it, the version she had been carrying for 6 years. Boyd had come home 3 weeks before the accident with something on his mind that he wouldn't fully explain. He had been making deliveries in his truck for a local logistics company, the kind of work he took on between bigger jobs at the garage, and he had pulled into a warehouse facility off Industrial Boulevard to drop a load and had seen something in the adjacent bay that he wasn't supposed to see. He had described it to her in fragments: pallets, medical packaging, men who moved like they were used to moving things quickly in the dark. A car she recognized from the news. He had said he was going to report it. 3 weeks later, a truck ran him off Highway 84 at 60 miles an hour. The driver had a prior arrest for drug-related activity. He had been released after 4 months. The case against him for Boyd's death had fallen apart, for reasons that Rhett had spent 2 years trying to understand, and 1 more year trying to accept. She had never accepted it. She watched Hawk's face while she spoke. He did not offer condolences. He did not make the sounds that people make when they are filling silence with something more comfortable than the truth. He just listened with those steady dark eyes and let her say all of it. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Then Decker's name came up on Hawk's phone. A text, brief. Hawk read it. His expression didn't change, but something in the set of his jaw did. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. The text said, "Driver who hit Boyd Calloway on 84. Name is Reg Tully. Currently driving transport for Voss Distribution Network out of Hewitt." Rhett read it twice. The man who had killed Boyd was still in Waco, still working, still moving things from one place to another in the dark, for the same people who had arranged for his freedom 6 years ago. She set the phone back on the table. She put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. She was not a person who cried easily, and she did not cry now. What she felt was something harder than tears and older than grief. The particular weight of a thing finally confirmed that you had always known was true, but had worked very hard not to be certain of. Hawk said nothing. He understood what silence was for. After a moment, Rhett said, "What do we do with this?" Hawk said, "We find someone who can use it." Sometimes fate doesn't bring two people together through coincidence. Sometimes it uses the pain of both. They had a plan by the time the sun went down on Friday. Decker had identified a man named Norris Fleet, a logistics coordinator in the Providence Medical Supply Department, who had been working in that building for 11 years and who, based on what Decker could establish through careful and indirect means, knew exactly what the numbers in that supply chain meant. Fleet was not a criminal. He was a man who had known something terrible for a long time and had been afraid to say it, which was a different thing. Decker arranged a meeting through a third party. Fleet agreed to talk. He agreed to more than talk. He had documentation, physical records he had been keeping in a storage unit off Bosque Boulevard, and he was willing to bring them forward if it meant the right people would hear what he had to say. It felt, for about 4 hours on a Friday evening, like the kind of break that changes everything. Then, at 9:17 at night, Decker called Hawk. Fleet's car had been found in the parking lot of a Whataburger on Waco Drive. Fleet was in it. He was dead. The initial assessment from the officer on scene, relayed through a contact of Decker's, was cardiac event. Norris Fleet was 41 years old. Hawk relayed this to Rhett in a single sentence. She received it the way she received bad news in the ER. No visible collapse, no outward fracture, just a brief stillness, and then the mind going back to work. But the work had changed shape. There was no witness now. There were no physical records. The storage unit, when Decker checked, was empty. Cleared out at some point that afternoon, a window of perhaps 3 hours during which Fleet must have told someone he was meeting with someone, or been followed, or something else that Rhett couldn't trace and didn't have time to trace. She sat at the kitchen table with the laptop closed in front of her. She thought about the drawer in her kitchen, about Boyd's phone, sitting in it with a dead battery for 6 years. She thought about what he had told her, the fragments of what he'd seen at that warehouse, the way he'd looked when he came home that night, careful, measured, the way Boyd looked when he was deciding something important and hadn't made the decision yet. She thought about what she knew about Boyd and how he thought. He had been methodical. He had been a man who believed in documentation, who believed that if you were going to say something happened, you should be able to show that it happened. He had kept every receipt from every repair job he ever did, filed by year, in a box in the garage that she had eventually donated without opening because she hadn't been ready to see his handwriting on all those small pieces of paper. He had told her once, "If something happens to me, look in the old toolbox under the bed." She had thought, when he said it, that it was one of those things people said, the kind of sentence that feels like it means something, but probably doesn't. She had never looked in the toolbox because she had never believed she needed to, and because the idea of going through his things with intention, rather than stumbling across them accidentally, felt too deliberate. Too much like finally accepting a thing she was still refusing. She sat at the table for a long time. Then she stood up and walked to the bedroom. The toolbox was still under the bed. She had moved it twice when she rearranged the room. 2 years after Boyd died, when she had needed to change something about the space because the space was suffocating her. She had moved it without opening it. She had put it back under the bed each time. It was an old Craftsman box, red, the kind with the latching lid and the metal handle worn down to silver. She pulled it out and set it on the bed and looked at it. She opened it. There were tools inside, real tools, a combination wrench, a stubby screwdriver, a folding knife. The things Boyd would have called the basics, the things you kept close because you never knew. Under the tools, wrapped in a shop rag, was a cell phone. Not his daily phone, a separate one. Older model, the kind that preceded smartphones. Basic, small, easy to overlook. It had been wrapped carefully, deliberately placed, the shop rag folded around it with the particular neatness of a man who meant for it to be found and used. Rhett held it in her hands. She went to the kitchen. She found a charging cable in the drawer, one of the old kind. She plugged the phone in and set it on the counter and waited. The screen stayed dark for 3 minutes. Then the charging indicator appeared. A thin red bar, barely visible. Then gradually, more. She stood at the counter and waited. While she waited, her own phone buzzed. It was Decker, texting through Hawk's phone, the way she had learned he did when Hawk wanted to keep his hands free. The text said, "Hawk's been picked up. Warrant. They're holding him at county, related to the parking lot shooting." She read it twice. She set the phone face up on the counter next to Boyd's old phone and looked at both of them. Hawk was in county lockup. Fleet was dead. The storage unit was cleared. Burgess had warned her that continuing alone would get her buried. She was alone now in a way that was not metaphorical. Outside, the rain that had started that morning had settled into a steady, patient rhythm. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, just falls and keeps falling, indifferent to whether anyone is listening. Rhett Calloway stood in her kitchen at 10:43 on a Friday night and did the things she had learned to do in emergency rooms when everything was going wrong at once. She stood still. She let her mind work. And on the counter next to her, Boyd's old phone continued to charge in the dark. She did not know yet what was on it, but she had known Boyd Calloway for 19 years. She had watched him wrap that phone in a shop rag and put it under the bed. Even if she hadn't known, that's what she was watching. She knew what kind of man he was. She knew what he believed about the relationship between what you saw and what you were obligated to do about it. And she knew this. Boyd Calloway did not wrap a phone in a shop rag and hide it under a bed without a reason. He did not say, "If something happens to me," unless he believes something might. She stood in the kitchen. The rain fell. The phone charged. And outside, somewhere across the city, a shipment was still coming. Friday night. That's what the USB drive had said. She looked at the clock on the microwave. 10:47. 3 hours and 13 minutes until midnight. She did not know yet what she was going to do with 3 hours. She did not know what the phone was going to show her when it finally had enough power to turn on. She did not know how to get Hawk out of county holding, or how to rebuild in 3 hours what had taken weeks to construct and had collapsed in a single evening. What she knew was smaller than all of that, but steadier. She knew she was not leaving this kitchen until that phone turned on. She knew that whatever Boyd had put on it, he had put it there for her. She knew that whatever came next, she had not come this far. Across 6 years of grief and 2 years of watching numbers, and 1 parking lot, and 2 bullet wounds, and a dead witness, and a locked-up ally. To stop in her own kitchen on a Friday night. She stood at the counter. She waited. The phone charged in the dark, and the rain fell. And somewhere across Waco, a clock was running down towards something that could not be stopped. The screen came on at 11:03, not with anything dramatic, just the slow, reluctant brightening of old hardware coming back from a long sleep. The battery indicator climbing from nothing to a thin sliver of red, and then the home screen appearing, pixelated and plain, the kind of interface that predated everything sleek and modern and designed to be looked at. Rhett picked up the phone. The wallpaper was a photograph she hadn't seen before. Boyd, younger, standing next to a motorcycle that wasn't his. A big touring bike, dark blue, parked in front of what looked like a rest stop somewhere flat and open. He was grinning. He looked like a man who had just done something that made him happy and wasn't sure yet whether to be proud of it or embarrassed. She didn't know when the picture had been taken. She didn't know whose bike it was. She made a note of it in the back of her mind and kept moving. The phone had no password. Of course it didn't. Boyd had left this for her. She went to the photo gallery first. There were 19 photographs in 3 video files. The photographs were dark, shot at night, clearly from a distance, the kind of images a person takes when they are trying not to be seen taking them. Grainy, imperfect, lit only by whatever ambient light existed in the scene. A loading dock. Pallets. Men moving in the organized, unhurried way of people who have done the same work many times and are not worried about being observed. She enlarged the photographs one by one. In the 4th photograph, she found the things she had not expected to find. She recognized the loading dock. She recognized the layout of the building behind it, The roof line, the configuration of the bay doors, the particular angle of the adjacent fence. She had driven past that building more times than she could count. It sat off Industrial Boulevard, 4 blocks from the Providence Medical Loading entrance, and it had operated for years under the name of a regional logistics company that she had never had reason to think about. Boyd had been there. Boyd had stood in the dark with this phone and taken these photographs of this loading dock and these pallets and these men. She kept going. In the 9th photograph, visible at the edge of the frame near the hood of a parked car, was a face she recognized. Sterling Voss was 49 in this photograph, 55 now. The 6 years showed on him in the ways they show on powerful men. Not diminishment, but consolidation. Everything about him somehow more compressed and deliberate than it had been. But the face was unmistakable. The jaw, the posture, the particular way he stood with his weight slightly forward, as though perpetually on the verge of making a point. He was wearing a dark overcoat. He was speaking to a man whose back was to the camera. He did not look like a man doing anything wrong. That was the most chilling thing about the photograph. He looked completely comfortable. He looked like a man in his own territory, conducting his own business, at ease with every element of the scene around him. Rhett set the phone on the counter. She put both hands flat on the surface and breathed slowly and let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. 6 years. Boyd had stood in that parking lot and taken these pictures and come home with something on his mind that he couldn't fully explain to her. And 3 weeks later, he had been dead. And for 6 years, she had known it wasn't an accident and had been unable to prove it. And the proof had been in a shop rag in a toolbox under her bed the entire time. She allowed herself 30 seconds of that. Then she picked up the phone and opened the first video file. It was 47 seconds long, shot from the same position as the photographs, low, at an angle, through what looked like a gap in a fence. The image was shaky in the way of something shot quickly and with one eye on the exit, but the audio was clear. She could hear voices, male voices, 2 of them close enough to the fence that the built-in microphone had captured them with surprising clarity. One voice she didn't recognize, clipped, logistical, the voice of a man running through a checklist. The other voice she recognized immediately, Sterling Voss, 6 years younger, standing 40 feet from where Boyd had hidden with his phone, saying, "Pruitt signs off on the intake. The hospital covers the volume. Nobody asks questions because nobody wants to ask questions. That's how this works." The video ended. Rhett stood in her kitchen at 11:17 on a Friday night with Boyd's old phone in her hand, and the voice of the man who had arranged her husband's death still echoing in the small space of the room. She had what she needed. Now she had to figure out what to do with it in less than 3 hours. She called Burgess. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he had been awake. She said, "I have something. It changes everything, but I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not ask me where it came from until I'm done talking." There was a pause on his end, the kind of pause that means a person is deciding something. "Go ahead," he said. She told him about the phone, about the photographs and the video. She described what was in them with the precision she brought to everything. Specific, sequential, no editorializing, just the facts of it, laid out in the order they would need to be understood. When she finished, Burgess was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway, if what you're describing is what you say it is, I can't take this to anyone local. You understand that." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm calling you and not someone else." Another pause. "There's an FBI field office in Dallas," he said. "I have a contact there, a supervisory agent named Harlan Prudhomme. He's been building a file on opioid distribution networks in Central Texas for 2 years. He's been waiting for something that connects the supply chain to the distribution end." "How fast can you reach him?" "Tonight," Burgess said. "I can reach him tonight." "The shipment arrives at that warehouse in less than 3 hours, Rhett said. "If they follow the same pattern, they'll be in and out in under 90 minutes. After that, the physical evidence moves. Burgess said, "Send me the photographs and the video, all of it, right now." She did. She heard him breathing while he looked at them. She heard the moment he got to the photograph with Voss in it, not because he said anything, but because he stopped breathing for a second in the way that people do when something confirms what they suspected but hoped wasn't true. "I'll call Prudhomme," he said. "Stay by your phone. Don't go anywhere. And Mrs. Calloway—" "I know," she said. "I mean it. Stay inside." She hung up. She stood at the counter. She thought about what staying inside meant, and whether it was the right thing, and whether the right thing and the safe thing were the same tonight or different tonight. And she thought about Boyd standing in that parking lot with a phone and a decision. And she thought about the toolbox under the bed, and the shop rag, and the 6 years of not knowing what she now knew. She put her jacket on. She put the .38 in her pocket. She picked up both phones, hers and Boyd's, and she went out to the car. She drove to Industrial Boulevard, not to go in, not to interfere with whatever Burgess and his FBI contact were setting in motion. She drove there because she needed to see the building, because 6 years of carrying something invisible needed to become, at least once, something she could look at directly. She parked on the street, 100 yards from the facility entrance. The building was dark from the outside, no visible activity. The loading dock on the far side, where Boyd had stood with his phone, was not visible from this angle. She sat in the car with the engine off and the rain coming down on the windshield, and she looked at the building and let it be real. Her phone buzzed. "Decker. Hawk is out. Warrant fell apart. 20 minutes. She wrote back. "Tell him to come to Industrial Boulevard, street side. I'm in the gray Civic." 3 minutes later, another text. "He says, stay in the car." She wrote back, "Tell him, I know." She stayed in the car. 22 minutes later, a motorcycle pulled up behind her and the engine cut. Hawk came to the passenger window. She unlocked the door and he got in, folding himself into the small space with the patience of a large man who has spent time in places not built for him. He looked at her. He looked at the building. "Burgess called Prudhomme," she said. "FBI Dallas. They're coming." "How long?" He said 90 minutes from when I called. That was 40 minutes ago. Hawk nodded. He looked at the building again. "You should have stayed home," he said. "I know," she said. "Boyd stood somewhere near that loading dock 6 years ago and took pictures of Sterling Voss running a drug shipment. And 3 weeks later, he was dead. I needed to see the building." Hawk said nothing for a moment. "I understand that," he said. She showed him the photographs on Boyd's phone. She showed him the video. She held the phone between them in the dark of the car, and they listened to Voss's voice together, tinny and clear through the old speaker, saying the thing he had said 6 years ago to a man who was no longer alive to repeat it. Hawk listened to it twice. Then he looked out through the windshield at the building and said, quietly and without heat, "He's going to answer for this." Not a threat, not a promise made to her, more like a statement about how the world was going to work from this point forward, delivered with the certainty of a man who had seen enough of the world to know the difference between the things that could be changed and the things that couldn't. "Your people," Rhett said. "Where are they?" "Close," Hawk said. She looked at him. "They're not going in," he said. "I made that clear. They're going to be visible. They're going to have cameras running. If this goes the way it should, there'll be witnesses. If it doesn't go the way it should, Prudhomme is going to have 16 bikers and their phone footage on the record before anyone can make this disappear." Rhett thought about that, about the chapter that had materialized around this situation the way it had, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just steadily and without asking for recognition. Men who had no obligation to be here, who had no legal standing in any of this, who were here because Hawk had said the word, and they had understood what it meant. "Why do they do it?" she asked, not doubting it, genuinely asking. Hawk was quiet for a moment. "Because that's what we are," he said. "Not what people think we are, What we actually are. She nodded. They sat together in the gray Civic in the rain and watched the building, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the silence between them had the quality of a silence between people who have said the important things and are now simply present in the same moment together. The FBI vehicles arrived at 12:51 in the morning. 4 of them, unmarked, coming from 2 directions simultaneously in the practiced, unhurried way of people executing a plan they have rehearsed. They moved to the building without spectacle. There were no sirens. There was radio communication she couldn't hear from the street. Hawk's people materialized in the same moment, not interfering, not advancing, simply appearing at the perimeter of the scene and standing there with phones raised, recording, visible, present. 16 men in leather and denim standing in the rain on a street in Waco, Texas, bearing witness to something that needed to be witnessed. Rhett watched from the car. At 1:14 in the morning, the loading dock lights came on. At 1:19, the first pair of FBI agents came back out with Dr. Warren Pruitt between them. He was in a jacket over what looked like pajama pants. He was carrying a laptop in both hands, holding it in front of him, away from his body, with the posture of a man presenting something rather than having it taken from him. Rhett watched. Hawk said, "He brought the laptop himself." "He was protecting himself," she said. "He knew eventually he'd be the one they sacrificed. He made a copy of everything." 4 years of records, Hawk said. He had been told about the laptop's contents by Decker, who had a contact near enough to the scene to hear things. Every transaction, every shipment, every signature. Rhett looked at the laptop in Pruitt's hands. She thought about Norris Fleet, dead in a parking lot Whataburger at 41 years old. She thought about Boyd, wrapped in a shop rag under the bed for 6 years. She thought about the 19-year-old boy she had stood over in the ER for 38 minutes on a Thursday night, the one whose heart had finally remembered what it was supposed to do. She thought about how many other 19-year-olds there had been, in Waco, in the surrounding counties, in the communities that had been quietly flooded for years, with product that moved through legitimate medical channels and into hands that had no prescription and no defense against it. She thought about the 9 names on Burgess's list. She watched Pruitt get into an FBI vehicle with his laptop and the accumulated evidence of 4 years of deliberate harm, and she felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too small a word and too clean a feeling for what this was, but was in the direction of it. At 2:40 in the morning, Burgess texted her. "Voss is being picked up at his residence. Warrant signed by federal judge. This is real, Mrs. Calloway." She read the text. She set the phone on her knee. She looked out through the rain-blurred windshield at the loading dock, where the lights were still on, and the FBI agents were still moving in and out with boxes and bags, and the careful thoroughness of people who intended to leave nothing behind. Hawk was watching the same thing. After a long moment, he said, "Your husband saw this building 6 years ago and knew what it was." "Yes," she said, "and he tried to do something about it." "Yes. He did the right thing," Hawk said. "He just didn't have enough of the right people around him when he did it." Rhett felt the truth of that land in her chest the way true things land. Not sharp, but heavy. Settling in. Taking up permanent residence. "No," she said. "He didn't." She looked at the building. She looked at the row of men standing in the rain with their phones up, recording, standing as witnesses to something that mattered. She looked at Burgess's text on her phone screen. She looked at her own hands on her knee, the left one still slightly weak from the shoulder wound, both of them steady. "He does now," she said. Hawk looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Sterling Voss was arrested at his residence on Estates Drive at 2:57 on Saturday morning. The officers who came for him were federal, not local. He came to the door in a bathrobe, and they showed him the warrant, and he looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man processing a reality that he had told himself many times was not coming. Then he went inside to get dressed, and they let him. And when he came back out, he was composed in the way that powerful men practice being composed. Chin level, eyes forward, the performance of equanimity that is the last defense of a person who has run out of actual defenses. There were no cameras outside his house at that hour. He had managed that much. What he had not managed was the warrant, or the laptop, or the 4 years of records on it, or the video on a dead man's phone of his own voice saying the thing he had said 6 years ago to a man he had subsequently arranged to have killed. He was remanded into federal custody without bail, pending arraignment. The local news had the story by 6 in the morning. Rhett watched it on her phone in her kitchen, standing at the counter with coffee, the way she had stood at that counter so many times in the past 6 years, alone, in the early morning, with the house quiet around her. The photograph they used was his official DA portrait. He looked exactly like what he had always looked like. That was the thing about men like Sterling Voss. They looked right. They looked like the person the community had decided to trust, and they leaned into that appearance with the full force of their considerable intelligence and discipline. And the appearance held because the community needed it to hold, because the alternative, that the person they trusted had been doing this to them, was too large and too painful to accommodate. Until it wasn't. Until she looked at the wallpaper, Boyd at the rest stop, grinning next to the dark blue touring bike, doing something that made him happy. She said, to the room, to the phone, to the 6 years between that photograph and this moment, "I found it, Boyd. I found what you left." The room held that. Then her own phone rang. It was Burgess. He told her what she already knew about Voss. Then he told her the rest. The driver, Reg Tully, the man who had run Boyd off Highway 84. He was in federal custody as well, picked up at his home in Hewitt at 3 in the morning. He had, in the first 3 hours of his detention, indicated through his attorney that he was prepared to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors in exchange for consideration on his sentence. Cooperate fully, which meant, among other things, testifying to the circumstances of the crash on Highway 84 6 years ago, testifying to what he had been told and by whom, testifying to the chain of instruction that had led from Sterling Voss to a truck on a dark highway to a man named Boyd Calloway who had simply been in the wrong place with the wrong information at the wrong time. Rhett sat on the edge of the bed and listened to all of this. When Burgess finished, she said, "Thank you, Deputy." "You did this," he said. "I made a phone call. You did this." She didn't argue with him. She thanked him again and hung up. She sat for a long moment. Then she lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. And for the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to cry. Not with the grief she had been carrying, which was still there and would always be there, but with the particular release of a thing finally finished. A wrong finally righted, imperfectly and too late, and by an accumulation of things that had nearly broken her a dozen times, but righted nonetheless. She lay there and let it happen, and didn't apologize to herself for it. 3 months later, on a Wednesday in late November, Austin Calloway came home for Thanksgiving. He arrived with a duffel bag and a backpack, and the particular energy of a 24-year-old who had been living on dining hall food and needed a home-cooked meal with a physical urgency that had become emotional. He hugged his mother in the doorway with the unself-conscious affection of a young man who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by it, and she held on a second longer than usual, and he let her. They cooked together the way they always had, her managing the turkey and the sides, him nominally helping, and actually eating his way through the process, both of them talking about nothing important and everything present. The easy conversation of people who know each other well enough to be silent in the same spaces, but choose not to be. After dinner, they sat on the back porch with their coats on and mugs of coffee cooling in their hands, and the evening came down blue and cold over the yard, and Rhett told him. Not the version she had always given him, the careful, abbreviated version that protected him from the full weight of it. She told him all of it. Boyd and the loading dock and the phone in the toolbox, in the 6 years of carrying it, in the parking lot on a Thursday night, in the 3 bullets, and what had come after. Austin listened the way Boyd used to listen, completely, without interruption, letting the story be what it was. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard, the oak tree at the back fence, the gate that still had the latch Boyd had installed and that Rhett had never replaced, even when it started sticking, because it stuck in the particular way that his hands had made it stick. "Why didn't you tell me?" Austin said, not with accusation, with the honest question of someone trying to understand. "Because I needed to be sure first," Rhett said. "Your father deserved to have people know the truth about him. The real truth. Not the version I believed, but the version I could prove." Austin looked at his coffee. "He would have done it himself," he said, "if he'd had more time." "He did do it himself," Rhett said. "He just needed someone to finish it." Austin looked at her then, the way young people sometimes look at their parents when they see them clearly for the first time, past the role and the history and all the accumulated assumptions of a lifetime of being related. He looked at her like she was a person, a specific, particular person who had done a specific, particular thing. "Yeah," he said, "he did." They sat on the porch until the cold made it unreasonable to stay. And then they went inside, and the house was warm, and there was pie, and the evening was simple and full in the way that good evenings are, present, unhurried, sufficient unto itself. On a Saturday morning in December, Hawk drove out to a neighborhood off Hewitt Drive. He went alone. He didn't tell Decker where he was going, which Decker would have found out anyway within the hour, and would have said nothing about, because there were certain things you didn't ask Hawk to account for. The garage had a different name on the sign than it had carried when Boyd Calloway ran it. Different owner, different paint, same building, the same roof line and the same layout and the same position relative to the street that Boyd had presumably looked at every morning for the years he worked there. Hawk parked across the street and sat on the bike for a moment. Then he got off and walked across. He stood in front of the garage for a minute. He looked at the building the way he looked at things, steadily, without performing anything. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out a chapter patch. Old one, worn at the edges, the kind that gets retired from a vest when it's been through enough. He had carried it in that pocket for 3 weeks without knowing exactly what he was going to do with it. He set it on the front step. He stood there for a moment longer. He thought about a man he had never met who had stood in a parking lot at night with a phone and a decision, and had chosen to do the thing that needed to be done, and had paid for it in the way that certain choices are paid for. Not because they were wrong choices, but because the world had not yet arranged itself to protect the people who made them. He thought about the woman who had finished what her husband started, 2 bullets in her body, hands still working. He walked back to the bike. He rode. The Iron Horse Tavern sat on Route 77 in the late December sun, looking exactly like itself. The sign, the gravel lot, the row of bikes along the fence that was always there on a Saturday, the smell of the place that hit you from 20 feet away and was not entirely unpleasant. Rhett drove past it on her way to Providence Medical. She was not going back to her old position. She was going in for her first week as the chair of the newly established Pharmaceutical Oversight Committee, an independent body assembled in the wake of the Voss case, authorized to conduct internal audits and report directly to a state-level review board, funded by a consent decree that was part of the federal settlement. It was work that needed doing. It was work that she understood better than almost anyone. It was also, she had decided, work that Boyd would have thought was exactly right. She drove past the Iron Horse without slowing. She glanced at the parking lot through the passenger window, the gravel, the fence, the neon sign unlit in the daylight, looking smaller and more ordinary than it had in the rain. She turned her eyes back to the road, and for the first time in 6 years, the corner of her mouth moved. A small thing, barely there, the kind of expression that doesn't ask for an audience. Just a woman in a gray Civic on a Saturday morning, driving toward work she believed in, carrying her grief and her husband's name, and the full, particular weight of what it had taken to get here. It was enough. It was more than enough. The sun was up over Waco. The road was clear. The morning was cold and bright and entirely real. Loretta Calloway drove on.